When we first decided to rent the old mansion for a family vacation, I thought it was just what we needed. The Ed had described it as a peaceful retreat in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where you could disconnect from the world and reconnect with your family. My wife had been excited about the idea of staying in such a grand, historic home, and our daughter, always up for an adventure, had begged to go as soon as she saw the pictures of the sprawling estate. The moment we arrived, though, I felt something was off. The mansion stood tall and dark against the horizon, much more imposing than the pictures had shown. The windows were like eyes watching us approach, and the trees surrounding the house seemed to bend naturally in the breeze. I tried to shrug it off. It was just an old house after all, and I didn't want to start the trip by being paranoid. My daughter ran up the steps, laughing as she explored the massive front porch. My wife gave me a reassuring smile, and we unloaded the car. The front door was heavy and creaked as it opened. The inside of the mansion was cold, colder than it should have been for late summer. Dust covered everything, though it looked like someone had attempted to clean at some point. Still, there was an overwhelming sense that this place had been left alone for far too long. The first day went by uneventfully. We explored the rooms, each one bigger than the last. There were old paintings on the walls of people long dead, staring out with blank, pale faces. The furniture was draped in sheets, and the fireplaces were massive stone structures that looked like they hadn't seen a fire in years. The house was silent except for the occasional creak from the wooden floors. It felt like it was waiting. That night, after dinner, we all settled in the living room by the fire. My daughter was playing with some toys she'd brought, my wife reading a book. The fire crackled, and for a moment, I began to relax. But then, without warning, the flames in the fireplace seemed to flicker in a strange way, as if something had passed in front of them. I glanced up, but there was nothing. My wife hadn't noticed, and I didn't want to alarm her, so I said nothing. It wasn't until later that night, after we had all gone to bed, that things took a turn. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps above us. Slow, deliberate steps, moving from one end of the house to the other. At first, I thought maybe it was just the house settling, but the rhythm of the steps was too regular. It sounded like someone was pacing in one of the upstairs rooms. I sat up in bed, listening intently. My wife was still asleep beside me, and I didn't want to wake her. The footsteps continued, moving closer to our bedroom door. I felt my heart rate increase as they stopped just outside the door. I waited, holding my breath, but after a few minutes, the sound faded. I told myself it had to be my imagination, or maybe an animal in the walls. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease from the night before. My daughter, however, seemed unusually quiet. She wasn't her usual bubbly self and kept glancing toward the staircase leading to the second floor. Finally, I asked her if something was bothering her. She looked at me with wide eyes and said, "I saw a lady last night. She was standing at the top of the stairs." My stomach dropped. "What lady?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She had a white dress and white hair. Her face was pale like a ghost. She didn't say anything. She just stared at me. My wife overheard and immediately tried to dismiss it as a bad dream. But I saw the look in her eyes, and I knew she felt the same creeping dread that I did. We decided not to make a big deal out of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that wasn't supposed to be there. That evening, things got worse. We were getting ready for bed when the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was just a power issue, but then the temperature in the house seemed to drop dramatically. I went to check the thermostat, but it was fine. As I turned back toward the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. A flash of white, like a figure gliding down the hall. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, but there was nothing there. I hurried back to our bedroom, only to find my wife standing by the window, staring out into the dark. She turned to me, her face pale. "I saw her," she whispered, "the woman in white. She was outside, staring up at the window." That was the breaking point. I told her we needed to leave first thing in the morning. There was something wrong with this house, something we couldn't explain, and I wasn't going to put my family at risk. We barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jump. Around 3 in the morning, we heard a loud bang from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, this time faster and more erratic. My daughter woke up screaming, saying the woman was standing at the foot of her bed. I rushed to her room, but of course, it was empty. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun rose, we packed our bags and left. I didn't care about getting our money back or what the caretaker might think. We just needed to get out. As we drove away, I felt the tension begin to lift. The farther we got from the mansion, the more I could breathe again. My daughter seemed calmer too, though she still looked out the back window occasionally, as if expecting to see something following us. It wasn't until later, when we were home and unpacking, that I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked inside one of my daughter's bags was a small, white ribbon, the kind you'd find on an old-fashioned dress. I asked her where she got it, and she looked at me, confused. The lady gave it to me, she said. She said she didn't want me to forget her. I dropped the ribbon, feeling a chill spread through my body. Somehow, the woman in white had followed us. Even though we'd left that cursed mansion behind, she wasn't done with us. And now, she had a way to keep reminding us she was still there, watching. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing weekend. A break from the stress of daily life, just me and two of my closest friends, getting away from everything. One of them, Matt, had invited us to stay at his family's cabin, a small, rustic place tucked away in the woods. I had never been out to this part of the country before, and honestly, I was looking forward to the quiet. No cell service, no responsibilities, just the three of us, a few beers, and the solitude of nature. The first night was peaceful enough. We arrived in the late afternoon, and packed, and Matt showed us around the property. The cabin was small, with one main room, a tiny kitchen, and a fireplace. Outside, there was a fire pit surrounded by old tree stumps that served as seats. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was thick in the cool evening breeze. We made a fire that night and sat around it, joking and reminiscing about old times. The stars were out in full force, brighter than I'd ever seen them, and there was an eerie calm that hung in the air, but it wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it was almost peaceful. After a few hours of sitting around the fire, we headed inside and crashed for the night. The next day, we decided to go for a walk. Matt mentioned there was an old trail that led through the woods and up to a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. He hadn't been there in years but said it was worth the hike. So, after breakfast, we grabbed our jackets and set off. The trail was narrow and overgrown, snaking through dense forest with trees that towered over us like ancient guardians. Sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy of branches above, casting the entire forest in a strange, dim light. It wasn't long before we left the comforting sight of the cabin behind, disappearing deeper into the woods. For the first hour, everything was fine. We were laughing, talking about nonsense, and Matt was pointing out different plants and landmarks he remembered from his childhood. But as we walked further, the atmosphere began to change. The forest seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. I didn't say anything at first, not wanting to seem paranoid, but I could tell my friends felt it too. The conversation slowly died off until we were walking in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a branch. Then we heard it, a howl, distant but distinct, cut through the silence. At first, I thought it might be a wolf or a coyote, but the sound was off. It wasn't quite animal, and it wasn't quite human either. It had this strange, otherworldly tone, like something caught between a growl and a wail. We all stopped in our tracks, exchanging uneasy glances. Matt tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just the wind or maybe a wild animal, but there was a nervous edge in his voice. We continued walking, a little faster now, but the forest seemed to close in tighter around us, the trees crowding together as if they were trying to trap us. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when we saw it far off in the distance, up on a hill that rose sharply out of the woods. There was a figure. At first, I thought it was just another tree, but then it moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in fur. Even from that distance, I could make out its glowing red eyes, two pinpoints of light cutting through the gloom of the forest. It stood still, watching us, its hulking form almost blending into the trees around it. But those eyes, they were fixed on us. My stomach dropped, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I could tell by the look on my friends' faces that they saw it too. Nobody said anything. We just stood there, frozen, staring at the thing on the hill. The forest was completely silent now, not even the sound of wind or birds. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat, thudding loudly in my ears. The figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. The ground seemed to shake with each step, though we were still so far away. I couldn't explain it, but I felt the vibration under my feet, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to pulse through the earth. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The creature stood still again, its eyes locked on us that we needed to leave. I wasn't sure what that thing was, but I knew we had to get out of there. I glanced at Matt, who nodded, his face pale. Without a word, we turned and started walking back the way we'd come, trying to keep calm. But inside I was screaming. Every instinct I had was telling me to run, but I knew better than to bolt. Predators chase things that run. We walked quickly, but it felt like we weren't getting anywhere. The trail that had seemed so straightforward on the way up now felt like a maze, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. The trees seemed thicker, darker. The air was colder. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that creature lumbering toward us, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the unsettling silence. And then the howl came again. This time it was closer, much closer. It echoed through the trees, reverberating in my chest. My heart was pounding now, and I could see the same fear in my friend's eyes. We picked up the pace, moving as fast as we could without breaking into a full sprint, but the thing was following us. I didn't need to see it to know. I could feel it. The weight of its presence, the way the forest seemed to shift around us, pressing in tighter with each step we took. The howls grew louder, more frequent. Each one sent a jolt of terror through me, making it harder to think clearly. Suddenly, we broke through the trees, the cabin finally in sight. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The door to the cabin was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. We hadn't left it open. I was sure of that. We ran inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us. For a few moments, we stood there, panting, listening to the silence. Then came the scraping. A slow, deliberate sound, like claws dragging against the wood outside the cabin. It circled the house, each scrape louder than the last. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in terror, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The scraping eventually stopped, and the air seemed to lighten, the pressure lifting from the room. We didn't see the creature again, but we didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, we packed up and left. None of us said a word about what we'd seen or heard, but we all knew. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and I have no idea why it let us go. Maybe it was toying with us, or maybe it was just a warning, but every now and then, when I'm alone in the woods or out for a hike, I get that same feeling. Like I'm being watched, and sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, I swear I can see those red eyes staring back. It was a freezing night in the dead of winter when I found myself at a reunion with my old schoolmates. We hadn't seen each other in years, but for some reason, nostalgia had pulled us all back together. Someone had rented a small, old barn on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just a single room with a wood-burning stove in the corner, a couple of tables, and some mismatched chairs scattered around. The place had that distinct musty smell that old barns get when they've been left to the elements for too long. Still, it was perfect for our little gathering. We weren't looking for anything fancy, just a place to drink, laugh, and catch up on old times. As the night wore on, the wind howled outside, making the barn creak and groan as if it were alive. Snow pelted against the windows, turning the world outside into a swirling whiteboard. It was the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones, no matter how close you are to the fire. But inside, we were warm and comfortable, wrapped up in our memories and the heat from the stove. There were about 8 of us, all crowded around the small fire, sharing stories, drinking cheap beer, and reminiscing about the stupid things we used to do in school. Laughter echoed off the wooden walls, making the barn seem cozier than it had any right to be. For a while, it felt like nothing had changed. We were just a group of old friends, stuck in the middle of nowhere, like time hadn't moved on. Then, at some point, I glanced out of the frosted window and noticed something moving in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the snow playing tricks on me. The wind had been whipping up gusts, and the swirling flakes often created strange, ghostly shapes. But this was different. There, just barely visible through the snowstorm, was a dark figure, walking slowly in our direction. I leaned closer to the glass, wiping away the condensation with my sleeve. My heart gave a slight jolt. The figure wasn't walking. It was gliding, or at least moving in a way that seemed unnatural, too smooth for the rough and even ground. It was cloaked in what looked like a long, dark hood, making it impossible to see any features. Just the shape. Just the way it moved toward us, steady and relentless. I tried to shake off the creeping unease and turned to the others. I pointed out the figure, half expecting them to laugh or brush it off as some local out for a walk. But when they crowded around the window, the room fell eerily silent. No one said anything for a few moments, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the wind outside. One of my friends, Tom, finally muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. We all stared out into the storm as the figure drew closer, its hooded form cutting through the falling snow. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone from a nearby house, maybe they were lost. But there was something off, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The figure moved too deliberately, too steadily, as if the storm didn't touch it, as if the snow couldn't slow it down. It was getting closer, maybe 100 yards away now. I could make out the details of its cloak, heavy and black, almost blending into the darkness of the night. The others began to whisper nervously among themselves, but no one had any answers. We had no neighbors nearby, no other cabins or barns around. Whoever this was, they shouldn't be out here, especially not in weather like this. Without saying a word, Matt, the guy who had rented the barn, stood up and walked over to the door. I could see the tension in his shoulders as he hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. We all watched him, and sure of what he planned to do, I didn't want to open that door. I didn't want to let whatever was out there in. But Matt, always the brave one, seemed determined to figure out what was going on. Just as he reached for the door, a loud bang echoed through the barn. We all jumped, hearts racing, as the sound reverberated around the room. It was coming from the roof, a heavy thud like something had landed on top of us. We all froze, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next sound. The wind outside roared, the barn creaked, and then another bang. Tom grabbed a flashlight and pointed it up toward the ceiling, but all we could see were the old wooden beams, swaying slightly under the weight of the storm. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, but the thudding continued, slow and deliberate, as if something was pacing above us. We heard a scrape at the door, the unmistakable sound of something dragging against the wood. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back, instinctively moving away from the door. Matt glanced at us, his face pale, but before any of us could stop him, he yanked the door open. For a moment, nothing. Just the howling wind and the blinding snow, but then we saw it. Standing just beyond the threshold, no more than a few feet away, was the hooded figure. Up close, it was worse than I had imagined. The cloak hung loosely around its form, but there was no face. Just a black void beneath the hood, no features, no eyes, nothing. It stood motionless, its presence filling the doorway, cold air rushing in around it. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my legs go weak. The figure made no sound, but I could feel it, a weight pressing down on my chest, a suffocating sense of dread. Matt took a step back, slamming the door shut with a loud bang. His face was as white as a sheet, his hands trembling. None of us spoke for a long moment. We all heard it then. A low, guttural growl, like an animal, but not quite. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the barn, vibrating through the walls. We were trapped. The growling grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right on top of us. The barn shook as if something massive was moving outside, circling us. The thudding on the roof continued, faster now, more aggressive. I could feel the fear rising in my throat, a wave of panic that threatened to take over. But then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. No more growling, no more thudding, just the wind outside and the sound of our own ragged breathing. For a few moments, none of us moved. Then, slowly, we approached the door again. I don't know why we decided to look, but something compelled us. We cracked the door open, just enough to peer outside. The figure was gone. The snow outside was untouched, no footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had ever been there. Just the empty, snow-covered field and the distant forest beyond. None of us said anything as we closed the door and backed away, too shaken to even process what had just happened. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence, each of us too scared to sleep, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, but nothing came. Eventually, the storm died down, and the first light of dawn crept through the windows. We left that barn as soon as the sun was up, none of us willing to stay another minute. I don't know what we saw that night, and I'm not sure I want to. But there was one thing I couldn't shake, something that still haunts me. As we were leaving, I noticed something in the snow. Just outside the door, where the figure had been standing, was a single, dark mark. It wasn't a footprint or an animal track. It was a handprint, pressed deep into the snow, the fingers long and twisted, like nothing I'd ever seen before. And that's when I realized. Whatever it was, it wasn't gone. It was still out there,